The reading this morning is 1 Corinthians 10, 23 to 33. All things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Do not seek your own advantage, but that of others. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience, for the earth and its fullness are the Lord's. If an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the grounds of conscience. But if someone says to you, "This has been offered in sacrifice," then do not eat it, out of consideration for the one who informed you, and for the sake of conscience. I mean the other's conscience, not your own. For why should my liberty be subject to the judgment of someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why should I be denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews, or to Greeks, or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking for my own advantage, but that of many, so that they may be saved.
Thank you, Jane. So where were the others? Where were the other t-shirts? About 30 years or so after Jesus' death, the early Christian leader Paul founds a church, a Christian community in the ancient Greek city of Corinth. At that time, Corinth was a thriving port city. And because of that, a place where people from all over the known world both lived and constantly passed through. Consistent with that kind of diversity, that church that Paul founds in Corinth is made up of both Christians from Gentile and Jewish backgrounds and from, again, all kinds of different places. Well, after Paul establishes that church in Corinth, he moves on to start another Christian community in another ancient Greek city, this time Ephesus. But while in Ephesus, Paul learns there's trouble back in Corinth. The Corinthian church is struggling. Serious divisions have emerged in it. Divisions in part due to the fact that the members of that Christian community have come from such varied backgrounds. Not just varied religious backgrounds, but varied philosophical and economic and political and philosophical backgrounds, with all kinds of different beliefs and practices. But those divisions also have emerged in larger part due to the struggles that those Christians are having trying to live faithfully within the context of the greater Corinthian culture that they reside within. A pagan culture, a deeply pagan culture, in which people have come to believe that they are free to do whatever they want, free to do whatever they want, wherever, whenever, and however they want. No limits, no restrictions, no concern or regard for others or the common good. A culture that is, as scholars have described it, rather licentious. A culture, in fact, which one historian has described, and this may be one of my all-time favorite quotes from doing research for a message. One historian described Corinth at that time as exhibiting a level of licentiousness that was remarkable, considered remarkable even for that time. That's a very polite way of saying Corinth was essentially Vegas on steroids. That early Christian community is struggling with how to live faithfully within that larger culture. And so in response, Paul writes a letter to the Corinthian church. It's a pretty far-ranging letter. But in this part of the letter that includes the passage that Jane just shared with us, Paul focuses on that particular issue. And he does two primary things. One is that Paul makes it perfectly clear to those individual Christians and that Christian community that when it comes to living faithfully as an individual Christian and as a Christian community, there is never, ever any such thing as freedom without limits, rights without responsibilities to others and the common good. And then the other thing that Paul does here is he presents a general guideline or a general perspective for those early Christians to take in terms of how best to live faithfully within that larger Corinthian culture. An approach that I think could perhaps best be described as, to borrow from another familiar phrase, when in Corinth, to a point. When in Corinth, to a point. And then Paul begins to make that point through the use of what in that time was a very common rhetorical device. He presents a debate, a back and forth argument, with a hypothetical, unseen representative of the other side. He presents a debate, a discussion between him and an unseen, unnamed, hypothetical representative of the larger Corinthian culture. That unseen Corinthian claims to Paul, all things are lawful. In the Greek that the letter is originally written in, more along the lines of, all things are permitted. To which Paul responds, okay, but not all things are beneficial. Not all things are helpful. Yes, but all things are lawful, all things permitted, the unseen Corinthian says a second time. And this time Paul counters with, yeah, I get that, but not all things build up. Not all things elevate, not all things strengthen the individual or the community. And then Paul proceeds to take a specific example, the eating of meat that has been sacrificed in a pagan ritual, and uses that to make a general argument about how those individual Christians in that Christian community can live faithfully within that larger culture can exercise their freedoms responsibly. And it is a combination of non-negotiables and negotiables. The non-negotiable, Paul states right up front, you cannot eat that meat whatsoever as part of participation in a pagan ritual. Seems pretty obvious. We wouldn't want to do that. However, Paul says, if that meat has been sold in the marketplace after the fact, something that was done all the time in Corinth, it's okay. You want to eat it, eat it. But, as part of the negotiables, if you are invited to a meal at a pagan household and that meat is served, but there's another Christian at that same meal and it bothers that person, then you need to take their conscience into serious consideration and probably not eat the meat. Now, is Paul saying that all of our decisions in terms of what we do should be determined by, governed by other people's conscience? No, he's not. He's making a general statement. He's providing sort of a general guideline from which to deal with specific instances. He is giving them some advice on how to best, but perhaps imperfectly, navigate that culture and still live faithfully. For someone who is so often characterized by many Christians, understood to be pretty dogmatic, inflexible, and rigid, it's a deeply nuanced and gracious argument that Paul seems to be making. And while he makes that argument in regard to the specific issue of religious freedom, it seems to me that he's really talking about freedom, period. How we are best to exercise freedom responsibly. That he is making the argument that freedom, whether it's religious or any other, cannot be without limits. That rights cannot be divorced from responsibilities to others and to the common good. So where were all the other t-shirts? If you were here a couple of Sundays ago, I am hoping that you will recall how I just raved about the country music festival that I took Cindy to down in Nashville at the beginning of the month. You remember that? How I raved about it? How I told you it was just the most awesome thing, one of the most awesome experiences of my life. How I couldn't get enough of it, how I wished it had lasted 2 weeks instead of 1. You remember that, right? Right? She's here today. Help me out. Okay, maybe not. But I'm hoping that you will recall something I actually did say. And that is that during that entire week, I saw a number of interesting t-shirts. Some funny, some that made you think. You know, the funny one being, remember I told you that I saw a bunch of women wearing t-shirts that said, "Raising my husband is exhausting." But if there had been an award given for the most seen t-shirt that entire week in Nashville? The winner, hands down, by a million miles, would have been t-shirts with the word freedom on them. Either the word freedom alone or as part of a phrase. T-shirts with the word freedom on them were everywhere that week. Everywhere. Day and night. T-shirts with the word freedom on them. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm a fan of freedom. I like it a lot. I'm guessing you do too. But when it comes to any concept like that, any idea, any ideal like freedom, the truly vital question is, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by freedom? And I raise that question today, just a few days before the 4th of July. I raise that question today because it seems to me, at least, that over the past few years, more and more of us, and we as a culture in general, are confusing freedom with license. That more and more of us in this culture have come to see freedom as being able to do whatever we want, whenever we want, wherever and however we want, no limits, no restrictions. Have come to see rights as being completely divorced from any responsibilities to others' conscience, to others, or to the common good. And as Paul says, or as Paul would say, that is not beneficial. That is not helpful. As Paul would say, that does not build up. That does not elevate, does not strengthen either the individual or the culture, the society, the nation. It is a view of freedom that is largely grounded in what social scientists and observers in recent times have referred to as our culture's move into a greater and greater level of hyper-individualism. Talked about Vegas on steroids. Hyper-individualism is individualism on steroids. An exaggerated belief in our freedom, our right to do whatever we want, whenever, wherever, and however we want, regardless of other people's conscience, of other people, or the common good. And that is not beneficial. That does not build up. In fact, it is the opposite. Because that hyper-individualism has been linked by many researchers to the dramatic increase in things like anxiety and depression in our culture in this time. And that may seem counterintuitive. Because we as a society, as a culture, in general, tend to associate freedom with happiness. But in fact, that kind of understanding of freedom, of rights, produces just the opposite. Something that the renowned French sociologist Émile Durkheim understood 125 years ago. 125 years ago, Durkheim said that when there are no restrictions, no responsibilities to others, people become more alienated and sad. Or as the Norwegian Trappist monk Erik Varden put it recently, not 125 years ago, the uninhibited pursuit of our inclinations is not freedom. It is enslavement. And what Varden means by that is that kind of hyper-individualism and the view of freedom and rights that it supports in reality makes us less free. It makes us less free because we then become captive to the very things that we insist on not having any limits to. Whether it's speech or guns or sex or our religious or political orientations. And beyond that, it not only makes us less free, it leaves us more open to the temptation to make others less free. Because once we convince ourselves that we can do whatever we want, whenever we want, wherever we want, however we want, that there are no responsibilities that come with our rights, it's not that far from there to the belief that what I want and what I believe, or what my tribe wants or my tribe believes, is what everyone should want, or everyone should believe, whether they want to or not. And from there, it's not very far to the next step, to actively seeking to take away the freedoms of others. And, in a deeply sad irony, often doing it in the very name of the God who sees all those other people we're trying to take the freedoms from as equally loved and valued. It is something that we are reminded of throughout these weeks of June. We've been reminded of throughout these weeks of June when we commemorate things like Juneteenth and Pride Month. The temptation to fall into that trap. It is a radical view of freedom. A radical view of freedom. One that would have been unrecognizable to the people who framed the Constitution or signed the Declaration of Independence, as imperfect, as limited in their vision as they were in their time and place. That view of freedom and rights is a child's moral logic. And I say that with the full confession that I may very likely be quite unfair to children. So where were the other t-shirts? Where were the other t-shirts? All those t-shirts in Nashville with freedom on them. All those t-shirts throughout our country, each day with freedom on them. All those t-shirts that will be out in greater numbers than ever on the 4th of July with freedom on them. Where were the other t-shirts? Where were the t-shirts that said responsibility? There wasn't a single t-shirt in Nashville that said responsibility. Not one. So, this week, as we commemorate the 4th of July, let us remember what Paul says to that church in Corinth. That for us as individual Christians and as members of the Christian community, there is never, ever any such thing as freedom without limits, as rights without responsibilities. As God's people, as members of the Christian community, on this 4th of July, on every day, let's push back a little bit on our current culture of radical freedom. Let's push back with a little bit of radical responsibility, the kind that Paul calls us to. And in fact, I've got just the t-shirt for the occasion. Amen.